Why, hello there, my fellow Americans. Welcome back to yet another, Well, anyway. There's a subject I would like to broach upon if you would entertain me for a bit. Just a mild curiosity. Don't worry. It's not really about Obama or the Fast and Furious, anything like that. You know, this isn't about guns today. It's not about the criminalization of legal gun ownership or anything like that, no. Maybe for another video, you know? But there's just so many topics to cover, so little time, oh my. We spoke briefly about the Contra scandal back in the day, back during the Reagan administration. A lot of interesting things happened during the Reagan administration. It's kind of fucked, really. But let me run down some stuff for you, okay? So essentially, what I would like to talk about is prisons. When you think of prison, you think of jail. You probably think of jail cells. You probably think of inmates. You think of guards. You probably think police. And what are police if not a government organization, right? Now you would probably think, right, and you wouldn't be wrong to do so, that prisons would also be run by our government. But considering the Federal Reserve, which prints our money, is privately owned, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised that most things in this country are privately owned. And unfortunately, most of the time, not privately owned by, well, anybody who has good intentions. That's neither here nor there. China can buy up all our national forests or whatever. Nobody seems to give a shit. But God forbid, there's a fucking forest fire and everybody loses their mind. Do we even own that forest anymore? Or is somebody, some other country fucking own it by now? Anyway, the Reagan administration. And of course, the Contras. I know, Contras, ooh, big scary guns. Oh, the government giving guns to Iran, selling guns to the Contras in, what, Nicaragua or some shit? Anyway, the guns aren't important, right? Like I said, as we moved in, and we pushed people out of the Middle East, and we did the whole Arab Spring, and fucking restructured things as we saw fit, took out anybody that wouldn't play ball with us, well, as we were doing that, the big deal, the thing that I wanted to make clear in the previous video about the Contras, was the drug smuggling. You see, the drug smuggling, right? The lying about it, it had far-reaching consequences. Okay, privately owned prison systems are kind of a branch of that tree, as it were. Now, let's take some interesting numbers, shall we? Right? So anyway, let's go down this little rabbit hole, shall we? See what it is we can find exactly. You'll have to forgive me. A lot of numbers here, a lot of statistics. It's hard to keep track of all of it. Alright, so what do we got here? Are there more private or state-run prisons? Obviously there's more state-run prisons, right? There wouldn't be more private prisons. That wouldn't make sense, would it? But why do we have private prisons? You ever wonder that? See, the idea that I always had in regard to private prisons is innovation. Consumerism, right? You have a product, people need that product, and you're selling it to them. How do private prisons make money? How is it that they profit off of having inmates? Well, they can charge up to $150 per inmate, per day, for housing an inmate, right? So you create an incentive for privately owned prisons to want to lobby in order to make certain crimes and punishments harsher. Let's take a quick little look at some timetables, shall we? Remember, Contra happened during the Reagan administration. What else happened during the Reagan administration? Let's see. So the Iran-Contra scandal happened in 1985, right? Is that what I'm understanding? Authorization to Iran were in 1981. Essentially, the 1980s is when the Iran-Contra scandal was going on. And, well, that's more accurately when they were figured out. I mean, as far as they can tell, that's when it happened, right? I don't personally think it ever stopped. I think we're still growing poppy fields over there in the Middle East and trafficking it into the U.S. for profit. But, that's just one clown's opinion. Okay. Now, bear in mind, these statistics alone are in regard to 2019, I think. I'm trying to find more pertinent information, but since 2000, privately owned institutions, right? Their usage increased by 77%, right? Now, this includes a number of things as to why the numbers would be so high. How does it increase by 77%, right? Well, think about it like this. The longer you keep inmates in, okay, they're already there. So when you introduce new inmates, you already have the ones there, right? Now, here's an important thing to remember. Okay. More than 170 prisoners and detention centers. Okay. Revenues in 2015 were $1.79 billion. That's a lot of money, isn't it? Now, here's the interesting thing, right? You would think privately owned prisons, okay? Well, how do they get paid? They get paid by the government. So the funny thing here is, the government is using your taxpayer money to give money to these private corporations, right? Instead of just running their own facilities. Okay? Now, why would they do that? Well, arguably, they say it's cheaper. Cheaper. So, problem, reaction, solution. You have the Reagan administration. They do the Contras. They start the drug smuggling operations. They're shipping drugs into the country, while also increasing the severity of punishments in regard to drug crimes. Did you know a large portion of these people who get arrested are arrested for non-violent drug offenses? Like, I don't know, having marijuana in their possession? Not even necessarily a quantity for distribution. Maybe even personal use. God forbid you have priors for similar things. Now you're a repeat offender. You're going to get put away for longer, right? You know, I don't know what the laws are in every state, but one particular state, the laws on things, for example, pot plants, right? I think it's like 5 years per plant. So how do we keep people in privately owned prisons so that those corporations can make as much money as possible by housing them? Well, they became popular in the 1980s. Privately owned prisons were popular in the 1980s due to overcrowding and the high cost of operating prisons. Oh my. The advantages of private prisons include lower operating costs, controlling the population of prisoners, and the creation of jobs in the community. Well, I would argue that if you had a government-run facility, that could also produce jobs, right? Correct. So instead of having this middleman, which supposedly is saving you money, I don't really see how. I mean, as of June 2020, the United States had the highest number of incarcerated individuals worldwide, with more than 2.12 million people in prison. The US was followed by China. Yeah, somehow we have more people in prison on the books than China. Brazil and the Russian Federation. I guess we're arresting more people than Putin. That's pretty nutty, isn't it? Oh, do taxpayers pay for private prisons? The answer is yes, and it's a lot of money. Report from the Daily Beast released in 2018. Immigration and Customs Enforcement spent over $800 million of taxpayer money on privately owned or operated detention facilities. Oh my. So let's get this straight. We're going to get to the detention facilities in a moment. So now we get to the point of, do private prisons incentivize longer prison sentences? Do you think they might? I think they might. Do I think a company, right, that makes its money off of housing people in its facility would want to keep people there for as long as possible to make the most amount of money out of that business? Of course. Privatization of prisons led to more inmates, longer sentences, study finds. Oh my. When states turn to private prisons, the number of criminal incarceration rises, and the length of sentences increases. That's not much of a surprise. The study found that private prisons led to an average increase of 178 new prisoners per million population per year. The opening of private prisons has a large effect on sentences. Oh. The length shortly after opening, but this effect dissipates once the prison is at capacity. So essentially, we just opened a private facility. And we need inmates. So, we'll just go ahead and increase the length of sentences. We'll lobby for it. And then once they get their quotas, once they get enough people locked up, they don't really care. They're making their money. They don't need more people. Interesting, okay. But the opening of public prisons had no such effect, suggesting that private prisons had an impact on criminal sentences that public ones did not. Ooh. Uh-oh. Well, let's think about this then, right? Maybe these private facilities are better at rehabilitating people. Huh? At turning a criminal into a God-fearing, righteous American again. Tax-paying American, as it were. Well, actually no. They don't. There's no incentive to rehabilitate people because that's not their business. They're not in the business of rehabilitation. They're in the business of housing people. Private prison companies sell their services to government agencies on a basis of lowering costs. But as the report makes clear, such promises are rarely kept. You'll save money, but actually you won't. Several studies have found that incarceration in private prisons increases the risk of, well, essentially relapsing into crime by almost 20%. If you go to a privately owned prison, you're 20% more likely to go to prison again. Interesting. I wonder why that could be. Well, like I said, this is the 1980s that the private prisons became popular because of the influx of people being put in prison, right? Why was there an influx of people being put in prison? Was there all of a sudden a boom in crime in the 1980s? What could have caused that? First decade of the 1980s to the 1990s saw the largest increase in the state incarceration rate, 107%. The largest share of this growth is attributed to changes in commitments per arrest, which accounted for 79% of the growth in the six offense analysis and 50% when drug offenses were excluded. 50% when drug offenses were excluded. Kind of sounds like 50% of those were drug offenses in the 1980s to 1990s, when the Reagan administration was running their Contra scheme and flooding the country with drugs. I wonder why there was an increase in arrests of people for drug offenses. Ooh. Well, why has the incarceration rate increased? It's a good question. 2014 report by the National Research Council identified two main causes of the increase in the United States incarceration rate over the previous 40 years. Longer prison sentences and increases in the likelihood of imprisonment. And we just determined that you are 20% more likely if you go to a privately owned facility to re-offend. What is the one reason for the increased number of prisoners in the U.S. since the 1970s? The number of U.S. prisoners exploded after the 1970s. In response to a tide of higher crime over the preceding decade, state and federal lawmakers passed measures that increased the length of prison sentences for all sorts of crimes, from drugs to murder. I think we all can agree murder's pretty bad, but what kind of drugs are we talking about? Are we talking about drugs that perhaps the government shipped into the country? Okay. What percentage of prisoners are non-violent offenders? 41% of convicted and unconvicted jail inmates in 2002 had a current or prior violent offense. Okay. 41%. Well, 46% were non-violent repeat offenders. From 2000 to 2008, the state prison population increased by 159,200 prisoners, and violent offenders accounted for 60% of this increase. What about the rest? That's a lot of people. 159,000 people from 2000 to 2008. What could have been going on from 2000 to 2008 that could have caused an increase of that size in the prison population? Well, we're not talking about the Contras for that. I'll get back to that. Spoiler. It counts illegal immigrants who are detained. Okay. So, what is a big issue? Well, probably mandatory minimum sentencing. Well, gee, when did mandatory minimum sentencing become a thing? 1984, baby. Yeah, I know, it's ironic, isn't it? 1984, George Orwell will be creaming his jeans. Well, mandatory minimums have been in place in some states since the 1950s. Their use grew after the 1984 Sentencing Reform Act, which added significant mandatory minimums for many federal crimes and abolished federal parole. But, again, you're probably thinking, what? Cocaine, black tar heroin, crystal meth? I don't know. Marijuana does count as a pretty high-class drug, doesn't it? Despite its innocuousy. When were mandatory minimum sentences created? When were mandatory? Well, they were created, minimums for federal drug offenses were created by Congress in 1986 and 1988. Over 260,000 people have received mandatory minimums for federal drug offenses. Oh my. Okay. Mandatory sentencing requires that offenders have a predefined term of certain crimes, commonly serious and violent offenses. Judges are bound by law. These sentences are produced through the legislation, not through the judicial system. So essentially what that means is, even though the circumstances might be in your favor, even though, maybe it was an accident what you did, or it wasn't that serious, well, it doesn't matter. They can't take that into consideration because there's a mandatory minimum that they have to lock you up for. Okay. Well, why was there a rise in the incarceration rate from 2000 to 2008? It's a good question, isn't it? Personally, I think it has something to do with the illegal immigration problem. Remember the caravans? Wouldn't it be funny? Because there was a drop-off, essentially, with the prison population. It just in general, mind you. And because of that decrease in the pool, well, these privately owned facilities also suffered. They had fewer inmates, right? They're looking to broaden their horizons. It's not just about incarcerating Americans, after all. See where I'm going with this? Well, let's get back to the Iran-Contra scandal, shall we? And the Reagan administration. Again, during the 1980s. The plan was later complicated in the late 1985. When Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Okay. So again, it's mostly they try to pin it all on the guns and stuff, but I think it has a pretty big role in the drug trade. That's not what's important here. The important part is that the affair, was investigated by the U.S. Congress and by the 3-person Reagan-appointed Tower Commission. Remember that name, Tower Commission. That's important for later. Neither investigation, so the Tower Commission that Reagan appointed to investigate Reagan and Congress, neither one of them found anything in regard to this scandal, right? Found evidence that President Reagan himself knew the extent of the multiple programs, okay? It's odd, isn't it? Additionally, the U.S. State's Deputy Attorney General Lawrence Walsh was appointed independent counsel in December 1986 to investigate possible criminal actions by officials involved in the scheme. In the end, several dozen administration officials they probably got indicted, including then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberg. 11 convictions resulted, some of which were vacated on appeal. So Congress didn't find anything. Tower Commission that Reagan himself appointed to investigate him didn't find it. But an independent counsel found stuff. Interesting. The rest of those indicted or convicted were all pardoned in the final days of the presidency of George H.W. Bush. Guess what? He was the vice president at the time of the affair. So the person who was the vice president during this ordeal then pardons people who were involved in the ordeal. Okay. Former independent counsel Walsh noted that in ensuing the pardons, Bush appeared to have been preempting being implicated himself by evidence that came to light during the Weinberg trials, and noted that there was a pattern of deception and obstruction by Bush. Well, the interesting thing about Bush, right? So not only was he the vice president of Reagan or whatever, and he was probably involved in the scandal, but he became a president, didn't he? Ooh, interesting. He took over, and what's this, huh? Bush's first major appointment was that of James Baker as Secretary of State. Well, if you're unfamiliar with what the Secretary of State does, the Secretary of State, appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate, is the President's chief foreign affairs advisor. The secretary carries out the president's foreign policy through the State Department and Foreign Service of the United States. Okay. Why is that important that he appointed this particular person for that position of Secretary of State? Baker was Bush's closest friend and had served as Reagan's White House Chief of Staff. So let me get this straight. Bush, who worked with Reagan when Reagan was smuggling the drugs, becomes president, presumably continues to smuggle the drugs, and appoints someone who used to be Reagan's White House Chief of Staff, who maybe was in the know on things, as his Secretary of State to deal with his foreign affairs. Mind you, the foreign affairs involve smuggling drugs into the country. And you get somebody who was also probably involved in the scandal. Interesting. Oh, it gets better. It gets better, folks. Bush's first pick for secretary, right? It wasn't James Baker. His first pick for defense secretary was John Tower. John Tower was rejected by the Senate, becoming the first cabinet nominee of an incoming president to be rejected. Wow. That's odd, isn't it? I wonder why John Tower was rejected for the position. There must be a good reason, right? Hey, that name Tower sounds familiar. Who is John Tower? Well, let's go take a look. Okay. Oh, what's this? Here it is. Tower retired from the Senate in 1985. After leaving Congress, he served as chief negotiator of the strategic arms reduction talks with the Soviet Union. Because, I mean, yeah, of course he did, right? And led the Tower Commission. Oh. Interesting. So, the person who led the Tower Commission, right, during the Reagan administration, to investigate Reagan, the people picked by Reagan, mind you, one of the people, okay, was going to be Bush's first pick. And they denied it. Of course they did. Does any of this sound shady to you? Sounds shady to me. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's all just one big, funny coincidence, folks. I don't know. You tell me. So you're probably asking yourself, what's the point? Like, why am I pointing this out? Well, in regard to the privately owned prisons, I think my political party, should I have one, would probably be keen to reduce privately owned prisons. I mean, if we do that, we can cut back roughly 20% of people who reoffend, right? I mean, you're 20% more likely to reoffend if you go to a privately owned prison, after all. But you know what? I don't think they really care that much about us anymore, about American citizens. Like I said, they also make their money off of detention centers. So it's really interesting. It really is, when you have certain politicians who perhaps incentivize people to come here illegally, knowing that they'll be picked up and caught, knowing that they'll be detained, and knowing that your taxpayer money is going to these private corporations that house these people. You're paying for people to go to jail that don't even live in this country. Isn't that crazy? That's how much America loves prison. That's how much we love jail around here. We're locking up people that don't even live here. Truly, it's a clown world that we live in. So hey, what do you have to lose, America? Why not one more clown in the political ring, fighting for you, fighting for the third party, and fighting to make sure the Democrats and the Republicans can no longer have the stranglehold that they do, that they can't lord this power, this endless back and forth power, this paradigm they've created of left and right, so that we can never make any sort of meaningful change. Whenever the Democrats are in charge, it's always the Republicans didn't let us do it. Whenever the Republicans are in charge, well, the Democrats wouldn't allow it. So then what are you good for? What are any of them good for? What do you have to lose?